In this lecture, we're going to talk a bit about principles of policy analysis. That is, as economists, how do we approach questions of policy and determining whether a policy is a good idea or a bad idea? First, Henry Hazlitt, in the book Economics in One Lesson, in the very first chapter, tells us really what economics is all about when it comes to looking at policy. And he tells us that the art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. Right, so that is, to put another way, it may be obvious to us that say, subsidizing farmers is a great policy for farmers. But this is not the end of the story. And what Hazlitt is really telling us is that we need to pay attention to the rest of the story if we're actually going to fairly analyze any particular policy. This is a technique that we're going to be using as we move forward. This small set of videos we're doing now really will just focus in general terms, saying, in general, what types of policies have what kinds of effects on which groups. So, the specific groups we're going to be looking at, we can really divide up into consumers, producers, and then the government budget, which will be affected by things like taxes or government spending. When we look in general at the effects that can be had on consumers, we're really just going to break it down into effects of two different varieties. First is what happens if we change the price of a good. Secondly is what happens if we change the quantity of a good that gets consumed. If we increase the price, this is naturally going to have a negative impact on consumers. Right? Consumers now have to pay more for the goods that they would like to purchase. Naturally, as a consumer, I don't like when the price of gasoline goes up. So this would be a case where it's very obvious consumers are negatively affected by price increases. Naturally, if prices decrease, we'd have the opposite impact. If we increase the quantity that consumers get to consume, this would have a positive impact. Right? Generally, consumers like to consume things. I like to have more stuff available to me. Right? So if we increase the quantity of the good available for me to consume, this would have a positive impact in general on consumers. Now, one way that we can make this very precise and mathematical is using the technique or the concept of consumer surplus. What consumer surplus is, the consumer surplus on a particular unit is really just the difference between the value to the consumer and the price that is paid by the consumer. So if I as a consumer believe a particular shirt is worth $15 and I'm only asked to pay $12, the consumer surplus on that particular shirt is $3. That's the difference between the value, 15, and the price of 12. So when we look at the whole, we can then take the consumer surplus on each individual unit, right, add them all up, and that tells us the total consumer surplus. Now, personally, I tend not to like consumer surplus. I think that it often obscures things because we may have some policies that benefit some consumers but hurt others. I think it's useful for us to keep those two effects separate. So I generally will steer away from consumer surplus, but if you hear that, that's really what is being talked about here, is what is the total difference between the value that consumers get from buying a good and what they have to pay for that good. On producers, we're going to look at things in a very similar way. First, thinking about an increase in the price of the product you're selling. Right? Naturally, if I, as a professor, if my income goes up, that is, my salary goes up, that's an increase in the price that I am being paid for the work that I do. Right? I would certainly take this as a positive thing. And I like when I get a raise. Right? If we increase the quantity sold, producers will also generally see that positively. That is, if I can sell more of my product, right, extending market share, what have you, this is something that producers look upon well. Right, so there's also this idea of producer surplus, really just a way to take this general story and make it mathematical again. Right, so the producer surplus on a particular unit is equal to the difference between the price received for the unit and the marginal cost of producing that unit. That would be the surplus that a particular producer gets on a particular unit. Right, so then we look at producer surpluses in the whole. We just take it for each individual unit and add them all up. So we could evaluate things on the basis of total consumer plus producer surplus if we want to. Since these are all mathematical terms, we could potentially add together. Now, once again, I steer clear of that myself just because the reality is most of the time we're going to be helping somebody and hurting somebody else, and I don't want to forget that as we do the analysis. Finally, we'll look at effects on the government budget. But this is relatively direct. If something happens that increases government revenue, perhaps you introduce a new tax, right, then that means the government budget is going to improve. Now, naturally, when we introduce a tax, that also means someone else has to pay it. So there's someone that's harmed. But on the government side of things, this looks like a good thing. Right. If we increase government expenditure, from a budget perspective, the budget is worsening. So this is how we will evaluate the government budget. And we can use these three different groups when we look at virtually any policy to figure out what are the effects going to be.